American Christmas has pretty deep roots in British Victorian Christmas traditions. They were largely established, the ones we're familiar with, by Victoria and Albert, which is a heritage of their German background, and they're mixed in with a lot of the traditions around the agricultural year and the nature worship that was also happening during the season of Yule. So although we are more and more blessed by a global vision of Christmas and seeing the traditions from all kinds of different places, American Christmas is still pretty dominated by a Dickensian kind of idea. You know, frosty windows, mistletoe, plum pudding, whatever that is, carol singing, you know, the stuff you see in the store windows and on Christmas cards. Now, as you know, the power of the Dickens classic from which that comes, A Christmas Carol, is a heartbreaking and heart-opening story of a social and economic disaster. It was years that were called the Hungry 40s. Dickens published his most famous writing, A Christmas Carol, in 1843, and it was absolutely a statement about the appalling lack of child labor law protections. And it carries this poignancy of what happens to the children in Victorian England, which really wasn't a very great place for very many people, but it was especially awful for children. The severity of the living conditions of 19th century England are difficult to exaggerate. The London skyline was a sea of smoke. It was an industrial age, and all of the vast industrial progress funneled money into the pockets of a very, very few, and otherwise created vast numbers of people who were constantly ill from near starvation. Small, emaciated children could be seen everywhere. The streets were covered in rainwater mixed with the leftovers from chamber pots and animal dung. Economic decisions were made by a small number of elites who made them strictly for their own advantage. In fact, in those days, both the laws of the land and Christian theology confidently assumed that people were poor because they deserved to be poor. They were bad. They were maybe even evil. They were probably immoral, and they were almost certainly lazy. And this was Dickens's London. And he was familiar with it, for he spent a childhood just like that. And most Christians resented Dickens fiercely. However, there were some people in that time who were positively inspired by Dickens and his accounting of what was going on with people. The Congregational Church was very active in new ways of helping the poor, and it expanded so much. This was the season when the Salvation Army got started, and the Methodists, I am pleased to say, started Sunday schools as a way of teaching children who were at work by age 5, 6, 7, 8 literacy. We started the idea that all children should be literate. And these groups and others like them met the needs of people with such conviction and such ferocity that they're still there doing that work, and not just in London, but all over the world. How God enters the world matters. How God comes to be with us is of surpassing significance for who we are called to be. The first Advent began in darkness and danger, and I dare say every Advent since then has been dark and dangerous for a lot of people. We talked about that some on the first Sunday of Advent, and if you want to hear a little more about that, you can go to ffumc.net. You'll find sermons, and that one is from November 30th. When we ask ourselves, what does it mean to say God is with us? Emmanuel. Well, what Luke is saying is not hard to hear, and it's not hard to understand. The good news is coming. The good news is coming, and it's for all the people. It's for all the people who don't usually get to be a part of the good news. It's not just for the elites. It's especially for the people who don't usually have any good news coming. What kind of people does God use for this? Humble in status, humble in temperament, also a little independent and courageous. The ache of injustice and suffering preceded the first Advent. We've talked about that some. But so did world peace, really. We imagine the world never knew peace, but the world that was part of the Roman Empire, which as far as the Romans were concerned was the entire world. I don't know where they thought rice came from, but historians would disagree with you that there was never world peace. They might assert that there was such a thing as world peace. It was called Pax Romana. Caesar inaugurated it. No one before had accomplished the feat that Caesar had accomplished, and he was declared a savior of the world because he ended the constant wars in the area that was the Roman Empire. One of my favorite West Wing episodes, and I have a lot of them, President Bartlett is waxing eloquent about how the Roman Empire was so well organized and so well administered that you could walk from one end to the other with a bag of gold on your hip in total safety. What he fails to mention is that was true for Roman citizens, who were 10% of the population within the boundary of the Roman Empire. And once you account for how many of the Roman citizens were in the urban areas, that means probably 99% of the people where Jesus was were not covered by this protection. Most people simply didn't have the right to physical and legal protections. They were considered expendable, about as important as a draft animal. Use up a slave or an ox, no problem. We'll get you a new one. And if you read history, you know that the way Caesar accomplished this is through brutality and violence. This was the world in which Mary and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem. A young girl from Galilee, quite possibly from an abused situation. We talked about that in the first Sunday of December. Women and girls frequently faced trauma and bodily trauma from occupying armies. And she's told by a divine messenger that something is really going to change for her. She's going to be pregnant. Oh, great. And a week later, we learned a little bit about Joseph, a father who was willing to become nothing so God could be everything. Like father, like son. The Spirit of God in this story is moving further and further out from the centers of power and the centers of status and the centers of propriety toward those more likely victimized by the empire than protected. And then God reaches deep into the trenches of the social fray today, stretching all the way to a band of shepherds. Now, for all my working life, every biblical commentator and scholar I had ever read, and I have not read them all, made much of the outcast status of the shepherds. They're described varyingly as despicable, expendable, filthy, criminal, the kinds of things you say about, and certainly dirty. And they were considered marginal as outsiders and probably lower on the status scale than that. This year, though, I was reading Amy Jill Levine and Ben Witherington's commentary, the Cambridge commentary on Luke, and they suggested that this is a misreading. It is a misreading of what we see about shepherds in relationship to God in the Old Testament. For example, King David. Anybody remember what King David did for a living before he became king? Right. And here's a test. The first line of Psalm 23. Yes. Levine and Witherington changed my thinking. Ancient readers and hearers, they tell us, would not have viewed shepherds as unclean or expendable or dirty. What they were is ordinary. And ordinary people didn't have a lot of power or a lot of promise or a lot of potential in the Roman world. Shepherds were just ordinary people, and like most people, they existed outside the circles of power. Isn't that just like God? To exalt the ordinary, the humble, the blue collar, the auto mechanic over the billionaire business person, the farmer over the famous celebrity. Here's something else I learned for the first time this year, which just goes to show you, because I have preached 44 Christmas seasons and I'm still learning something new. Lucky for you. Bethlehem was the center of the meat industry. Like, Chicago, the center of the meat industry. And it wasn't just for people who ate meat. It was the center of the place where the livestock could get. Bethlehem's only about 4 miles from Jerusalem. And you can get your livestock to where the temple is. Goats, sheep, things like that you use for sacrifices or to pay the temple tax. Unbelievable. It was not just food. Now, the shepherds don't usually own land. Not much different than now. Some people owned vast herds and flocks. The shepherds were not those people. They worked for those people. Mostly they had, if they were a smallholder, they might be taking care of their own small flock, but even then they would sell the animals off to a dealer who would get them either slaughtered and taken to Jerusalem or taken to Jerusalem for slaughter. Now, in case you're interested, this is one part of the economic system that got Jesus so angry at the temple. So they were nomadic. Because when you have livestock like this, you're nomadic. Animals need to change from spring pastures to fall pastures. Sheep and goats, particularly goats, will eat things down to the dirt and nothing can grow. So they have to be moved around so that the pasturage available isn't demolished. We think of it as something, nomadic lifestyle, something for people who either have some kind of sense of adventure and want to live in a van, or people who haven't quite got their act together. Either way, the shepherds and their kind lived outside the circles of towns and villages and certainly cities. And in Rome, in the Roman system, everything is binary. Everything is black and white. You're either inside or you're outside. Period. There is no liminal space. You were either a citizen of Rome or you were a supplicant of Rome. You were either loyal to Caesar or you were an insurrectionist. I don't know if this sounds to you like other dictatorial authoritarian regimes. You're Ferris or you're Guinness, right? Shepherds were easily considered enemies of the state simply because they weren't part of the system. Yes, they were outsiders, like 99% of the people they knew. Now, in those days, a public announcement of a great birth sounded remarkably like this story of Jesus. It had become tradition to celebrate the birth of a child to a Roman emperor by proclaiming that God has come. It was a standard part of the Roman mythology. And Luke is giving us something very much like that, with some notable exceptions. Our gospel writer uses the same kind of language, but what a contrast of context. What a contrast of context. What a provocation. Who's king here anyway? Who is king here anyway? Jesus does not belong to the elite, and his birth reflects that. He does, however, belong to God, so his birth makes it clear that God does not belong to the elite. Now, that's a radical idea at the time. It's natural for us now, 2,000 years later, to say, of course God belongs to everybody and everybody belongs to God. That was not so at this time. So, no real big announcements except for the shepherds. That's who gets the Gloria. What Luke is saying isn't that hard to hear or understand. The good news is coming, and it's for people who are hardly ever part of good news. And who does God use? Humble in status, humble in stature, humble in temperament. Also, courageous and independent. Let's go to Bethlehem and see what on earth is going on. And what do they get for their troubles? Angels singing Handel's Hallelujah Chorus. What a story. The messengers of God, God's own presence. You know, there's no real difference between an angel and God. They're not separate entities. That's how the Bible talks about God showing up in sort of a wild, mysterious, lights in the room kind of way. And the angels, God's presence, you can't look at God, so you got to look at this thing that's the presence of God, kind of like a burning bush for Moses and so on, passing on to ordinary people the kind of glorious, transcendent spectacle that's usually reserved only for the elite. The angels may have been talking to ordinary shepherds, but their song was still a Gloria. They pull out all the stops. You don't get the sense that they're like practicing on the shepherds till they can find somebody more important. It's the whole Megillah, even for the nobodies. It's the Gloria for all comers. I like to think that our world is a far cry from the filth and desperation of Dickens's London. But all of humanity is our village now, and there's a lot of suffering everywhere. Some of it's on this block. And I can't stress this enough. That's why there's Christmas. That's why there's Christmas. I know this is not what the retailers want to hear. They are able to meet their year-end goals because of Christmas, but Christmas isn't here to help the retailers. I don't think there's any harm in helping the retailers, mind you, so if you haven't done your shopping, get out there today. But for the poor, and for the rich too, we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks, for the ordinary and the exceptional, for all the places and spaces where we are lost and broken and suffering and crucified, Jesus comes. We have modern-day Tiny Tims. There's a real need. Some people have lived in poverty for generations, and in some places, for centuries. There's sorrow and captivity and addiction and crushing labor. And whatever is hurting your heart today, and whatever gratitude and joy and delight is filling your heart today, this Gloria is for them and for you. We often think of peace as being without trials and troubles, the absence of pain or the absence of war, but that's a temporary peace. We celebrate it when it happens, but our deep peace comes from something else. Knowing that we are never alone, God is with us. We are never alone. Emmanuel, God is with us. Always. Christmas arrives just in time every year to turn us where we have wandered off the path into busyness and confusion and sorrow and trouble, and bring us back to the light of the Gloria. Christmas arrives and opens us to the world, finding in us hearts seeking to give rather than get. Hearts broken by the suffering of others, hearts filled with the hope that Jesus-filled hearts have, and we sing Gloria to the world. Our commitment to live generously here at Fullerton First United Methodist Church, to love Jesus more and more each day, to open ourselves to God's love and healing in our lives, God's promptings, God's peace, making a place right here for the angels to sing their Gloria for us and for everyone.